Today we're going to be solving polynomials by completing the square. Our essential question is, how do we use completing the square to solve a polynomial? So for example 1, we're going to use factoring and completing the square to solve 3x cubed, take away 9x squared, plus 6x equals 0. Now when you're using completing the square, you cannot complete the square on a function with degree greater than 2. So what we have to do first is we have to factor out the x that all of these have in common so that we can get it down to a quadratic function. So the first thing we're going to do is see what they all have in common. They're all divisible by 3 and they're all divisible by x. So I'm going to factor out 3x from the equation, and I'm left with x squared take away 3x plus 2, and that's equal to 0. So my next step is I'm going to go ahead and solve for this particular root over here. 3x equals 0 is going to be one of my roots or solutions, and we get that x has a value of 0. So we're going to hang on to that one. Now we're going to take the rest of the equation, the x squared minus 3x plus 2, and we are going to complete the square using the rest of that equation. Okay? So here's your steps for completing the square. You're going to take the rest of your equation, and we are going to get the x squared minus 3x by itself. So this plus 2, I'm going to move to the other side. So that's going to be equal to negative 2 on the other side. So again, take your constant and move it to the other side. Okay. Now that I've done that, I'm left with x squared minus 3x equals negative 2. My next step, so step 1 was move the c term, the constant, to the other side. Step 2, you're going to look at your middle term, which is the 3x. You want to take half of that value. So we're going to take that negative 3 and we're going to divide it by 2. Once I get that fractional value, now I'm going to take that number and I'm going to square it. The whole idea to completing the square is we need to add in a number that's going to be a perfect square. And that number just happens to be negative 3/2 squared. When you square a fraction, multiply the top times itself. Negative 3 times negative 3 is a positive 9. 2 times 2 on the bottom is a positive 4. Okay, so the number that I'm adding on the left side, my equation, is 9/4. Now whatever I do to one side, it's the golden rule of algebra. Whatever you do to one side, you got to do to the other. So I'm adding 9/4 to the other side as well. Okay, my next step, once I have completed my square like I just did, my next step is to take and factor it now. So now I'm ready to break it down. Square root, or what times itself is equal to x squared? X times x. What number did we multiply by itself to get 9/4? Negative 3/2. So I've now factored it. Okay, now step number 3, factor the resulting quadratic. And then on the other side, I don't need to factor, I just need to combine like terms. So on the other side I've got negative 2 plus 9/4. Well, 9/4 is 2 1/4, and when you add negative 2 to that, you get 1/4. Okay. So, we have completed the first 3 steps. My next step is to rewrite it as a square. So I'm going to take x minus 3 halves times x minus 3 halves, and I'm going to rewrite it as x minus 3 over 2 squared. That is equal to 1/4. Now, because it's now a square, I can now square root it. So we're going to square root both sides, and then we are going to simplify. And then we'll be done. So when I square root both sides, remember, if you put a square root into the problem, you have to do both the positive and the negative. So when I put this square root in here, make sure that you get that plus or minus right there. That's very important. That's where your 2 answers are going to come from. So be sure to put the plus and minus. So on this side, I've got x take away 3 halves. When you square root a square, they just cancel each other out. On the other side, I've got plus or minus the square root of 1/4. Well, square root of 1 is 1. Square root of 4 is 2. So square root of 1/4 is 1/2. Last step, I'm now going to add 3 halves to both sides. And so I end up with 2 answers. My first answer is positive 1/2 plus 3 halves, which is equal to 2. And my second answer is negative 1/2 plus 3 halves, which is equal to 1. So we had 3 solutions to this problem. Remember, we had a degree of 3. We had x equals 0. That was the one that we solved for way back at the beginning. We had x equals 2, and we had x equals 1. And yes, you could have done this one by factoring, but we wanted to practice using completing the square. So record this and go ahead and pause. We'll do one more example. Alright, example 2. Solve by completing the square. We've got x squared take away 8x plus 10. First step, let's move that 10 to the other side. So we have x squared minus 8x equals negative 10. Next step, we're going to take half of 8. Half of 8 is 4. And we want to square that. And that's the number we're going to add to both sides. So we're going to add a 16 on the left side. We're going to add a 16 on the right side. Next step, factor. So now we're going to take x squared minus 8x plus 16, and we're going to break it down. And it should be a perfect square trinomial. So we've got x times x. We've got 4 times 4. And to get a negative in the middle, we need a minus and a minus. On the other side, 16 take away 10 is 6. Okay, just a couple more steps and we're done. X minus 4, we've got 2 of them, so we've got x minus 4 squared, and that's equal to 6. Undo the square by square rooting on both sides. Remember, to put your plus or minus. Now we're almost done. Square root of x minus 4 squared is x minus 4. You really don't need the parentheses. On the other side, plus or minus square root of 6. I'm going to leave that alone because it is not, it's an ugly decimal, yeah. So x minus 4 is equal to that. So last step, we're going to add 4 to both sides. And my final answer is x equals 4 plus the square root of 6. And x equals 4 minus the square root of 6. Those are my exact answers. You could come up with approximations if you wanted to. Go ahead and pause, record, and you're done. We'll talk more about this tomorrow. Have a good day.